The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to table and to read some words of the Premier's.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table and read some words of the Premier's that I agree with. They come from 2007 when he was first Liberal leader. And the context was that the Conservative government had just brought forward legislation revoking the right to strike for healthcare workers and community services workers. And the Premier said, at the table, they will not always agree. Let's be honest. There will be tough times sitting at the negotiating table. Mr. Speaker, people died for the right to strike, unquote. Mr. Speaker, whatever turned the Premier into someone for whom tough times at the table means legislation instead of negotiation?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. We're actually, the bill that the honourable member is debating actually is giving them the right to strike, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, I want to go back, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to go back, Mr. Speaker, to the reality, Mr. Speaker. We went to the bargaining table, Mr. Speaker. We offered a 7%. Crowns came in with 17%, Mr. Speaker. Day two, they were looking for arbitration, Mr. Speaker. We went back and we collapsed steps in the pay order, Mr. Speaker. A starting crown today is $65,000, which has been accurate, Mr. Speaker. On the meeting signing this agreement, they would go to $81,000, and those changes would be through the entire pay order for crowns, Mr. Speaker, who, by the way, are the highest paid in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker. What we are unwilling to do, Mr. Speaker, they came to the bargaining table with one mission, and that was to send a 17% to an arbitrator, Mr. Speaker. This province can't afford a 17% increase by an arbitrator.
Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Surely, Mr. Speaker, the truth is still worthy here in this context of some regard. Now, I will table and read, too, this statement of the Premier's. This is from 2013, and this is a statement I also agree with. The foundation of any collective bargaining is the fact that the employer and employee have to be at the table feeling equal, feeling that they are both having their voices heard, and negotiating and working out what is an agreement that will potentially last for years down the road. In order for the agreement to have any kind of substance, both the employer and the employee have to feel valued at the end of the day when that agreement is finished. Let me ask the Premier, can he find a single word in that statement that is consistent with his treatment this week of the Crown Attorneys of our province?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very much, Mr. Speaker. I've just laid out to the honourable member. The Crowns came to the table with 17% and wanting to go immediately arbitration, Mr. Speaker. That's not free and open collective bargaining, Mr. Speaker. He's very right, Mr. Speaker. They were not looking for a deal. They were looking for an arbitrator of 17%. And unlike the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, this province cannot afford a 17% increase.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, we were treating Crowns fairly, Mr. Speaker. There's a 4% increase across the top, Mr. Speaker, through the entire steps. Plus 7%, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable members, Mr. Speaker, they are the highest paid crowns in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about, Mr. Speaker, being fair to all public servants. That's what this piece of legislation is about, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Teachers, healthcare workers, civil servants, lawyers, every time this government enters into negotiation, we're ended up with a huge swath of people who have been disregarded, disrespected, and under the heavy hammer of legislation. And all of this stands in such profound contrast to the commitment that this Premier made to the people of the province in the open letter that I tabled here yesterday, in which he pledged himself to be an upholder of collective bargaining and a protector of the rights of workers. Let me ask the Premier, does he agree with me that the word of the government of Nova Scotia is something that is very important, and the word of the Premier of Nova Scotia is something that is very important, and that both of these are things that ought to be able to be trusted in by the people of our province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said a few minutes ago, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker, I've been consistent from day one in this job, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to ensuring that we treat our workers fairly in this province, provide a collective agreement this province can afford. I hear the member from Cape Breton again, Mr. Speaker, interrupting. Let me be clear about this, Mr. Speaker. When they had an opportunity to govern, they increased 7.5% pay wages across the teachers, and they took $65 million out of the classrooms on the backs of our children to get an agreement, Mr. Speaker. These, Mr. Speaker, negotiations are tough, Mr. Speaker. When you go to the bargaining table, Mr. Speaker, both sides have to be willing to look for an agreement, Mr. Speaker. I want to repeat again. The Crown's came to the table with a 17% increase and wanted to go to arbitration. We brought in, Mr. Speaker, a 7% pay raise. We went through the steps after that, Mr. Speaker, to try to get a deal to collapse them, increasing almost every Crown across this province would have seen on day one of signing this agreement, plus the 7%, Mr. Speaker. That is a government looking for a deal, Mr. Speaker, not one looking for a third party one to give us 17%.